I'm here on Chiswick High Street to tell a tale of a wife who killed her love rival. In September 10th, 2002, Rena Salmon parked up just here behind me.
Before I say anything else about this case, I want you to picture something. A quiet, half-empty hair salon on a busy high street in West London, late one September afternoon in 2002. A young woman is on shift, expecting nothing more than the rest of an ordinary working day. And then the door opens, and in walks someone she knows. Someone from her old life, from the village she used to live in before everything changed. And within a few short moments, that ordinary afternoon ends in two gunshots, fired by someone who, up until that day, had spent years of her adult life being trained by her own country to shoot exactly like that. Because the woman who walked through that door wasn't just an angry, betrayed wife. She was a former British Army markswoman, and she was about to become one of the most talked-about killers in the country, in a case that most people outside the UK have never even heard of, even though it played out in one of London's busiest neighborhoods in broad daylight. If you enjoy true crime stories that dig past the headlines and into what actually happened, do me a favor and hit subscribe right now, because this channel puts out a brand new case just like this one almost every single day, and you genuinely don't want to miss what's coming next. This isn't a story that unfolded in some remote small town either. It happened right in the heart of West London, on a street lined with shops and buses and ordinary people going about their day, which somehow makes the whole thing feel even more unsettling once you learn exactly how it played out. Now let's get into the story of Rena Salmon, and the affair that ended with her walking into a Chiswick beauty salon carrying a shotgun. Rena and Paul Salmon didn't meet at a bar or get introduced through mutual friends the way a lot of couples do. They met while both of them were serving in the British Army, stationed together in Northern Ireland during a period when service there meant genuine danger and genuine pressure on a daily basis. Rena had trained as a sharpshooter and served as a member of the Women's Royal Army Corps, a skill set that would end up meaning far more than anyone around her, including Rena herself, could ever have imagined at the time. Paul served as a non-commissioned officer in the Royal Corps of Signals, working as an army technician, the kind of steady, technical role that often becomes a launching pad for a second career once a person leaves the military behind. The two of them fell for each other the way a lot of couples do inside that world, bonded by shared discipline, shared distance from home, and the particular kind of closeness that comes from serving alongside someone during difficult postings. Sometime in the mid-1980s, they got married. Not long after the wedding, both Rena and Paul took voluntary retirement from the Army and stepped into civilian life together, leaving behind the structure and routine of military service for something quieter. They settled down in Great Shefford, a small, picturesque village near Hungerford in Berkshire, and over the following years, they built the kind of life a lot of people spend their entire careers chasing. Paul reinvented himself as an IT consultant, and he turned out to be very good at it, eventually earning somewhere around £130,000 a year, serious money for a household in that part of England at the time, enough to fund a genuinely comfortable, almost enviable lifestyle. He and Rena had 2 children together, including a daughter named Jasmine. They threw parties for friends in the village. They had an outdoor hot tub in their garden. Neighbors would come over on warm evenings, share bottles of wine, and settle into that easy, unhurried rhythm that affluent village life in the English countryside tends to allow. Among those neighbors were a couple named Keith Rodriguez and his wife, Lorna Stewart. Lorna was younger than Rena, attractive, and worked as a massage therapist at a beauty salon called Equilibrium, located on Chiswick High Road in West London, a decent commute from the village but well within reach for someone building a career in the city. She and her husband Keith became genuinely close with the Salmons over time, close enough to be regulars at those hot tub evenings, close enough that nobody watching the two couples from the outside would have guessed anything was wrong. For years, it looked exactly like what it appeared to be on the surface. Two ordinary, comfortable couples enjoying ordinary, comfortable lives in the English countryside, trading dinners and wine and long conversations in each other's gardens. Underneath that surface, though, something had already started to shift, quietly, in a way nobody in that circle of friends had picked up on yet. Sometime between late 2001 and early 2002, Rena began to sense that something wasn't right in her marriage, the kind of low, persistent unease that a lot of spouses describe feeling before they can name exactly what's wrong. As it turned out, she didn't have to go looking for the truth for very long, because someone else in that friend group uncovered it first, and from an angle nobody would have predicted. Keith, Lorna's own husband, came across an email on his wife's computer, and what he read in it made it unmistakably clear that Lorna was having an affair, and that the man she was sleeping with was Paul Salmon, his neighbor, his friend, the man whose hot tub he'd been sitting in for years, sharing drinks and laughter with, having absolutely no idea what was actually happening underneath all of it. Keith went straight to Rena and told her what he'd found. It is hard to imagine a worse way to learn that your 18-year marriage is effectively over, not from your own husband sitting you down to confess, but from the husband of the woman he had been sleeping with, delivering the news to you unprompted, both of them equally blindsided and betrayed. What followed happened fast, and it happened without much attempt at repair or reconciliation. Paul didn't try to hide what had been going on or patch things up with Rena once it was all out in the open. Instead, he moved out of the family home in Great Shefford entirely and set up a new home together with Lorna, who by that point had left Keith and gone back to using her maiden name, Stewart, effectively starting over as a couple with the man she'd been secretly involved with for months. After 18 years of marriage, 2 children, a shared history stretching back to their days in the army together, Rena Salmon was suddenly alone, left to watch her husband build a brand new life with a woman who had spent years sitting across from her at dinner parties, drinking her wine, and laughing in her garden as though nothing at all was wrong. For the months that followed, Rena's world narrowed down to that single, unbearable fact. She wasn't just losing her husband to someone else. She was losing him to someone she had personally trusted, someone she had welcomed into her home and into her closest circle of friends, someone who had sat beside her husband while smiling directly at her. And as the months wore on through the spring and summer of 2002, whatever grief Rena was carrying began curdling into something darker and harder to contain. She would later describe her own thinking during this stretch of time as disjointed, distorted by the depression that came from watching her marriage collapse in real time. At trial, her defense team would try to frame this entire period as the psychological foundation for a diminished responsibility argument, a case built around the idea that her judgment had become genuinely impaired. But long before any courtroom got involved in any of it, Rena Salmon was simply a woman coming apart in private, 9 long months into watching her old life get quietly dismantled and rebuilt by 2 other people right in front of her. The day before the murder, Rena called up a friend and said something that, in hindsight, reads almost like a warning that nobody around her managed to catch in time. She told her friend she had a gun in her possession, and she said, according to that friend's later account, that she wasn't planning to kill Lorna only to hurt her, to shoot her in a way that would stop her from ever having children of her own. It is a chilling thing to say out loud to another person over the phone and then simply hang up. As far as anyone can tell, nobody intervened. Nobody called the police. It seems to have been absorbed in the moment, as the kind of overwrought, dramatic thing a devastated, grieving woman says in the middle of a breakdown, rather than as an actual plan that was already quietly moving into motion. The next morning, Rena drove her 10-year-old daughter Jasmine to school, just like she did most weekday mornings, sticking to the same familiar routine the family had followed for years. But before Jasmine climbed out of the car that day, Rena said something to her that Jasmine would remember for the rest of her life. to always remember that her mother loved her, no matter what happened. It is the kind of sentence that sounds completely ordinary and reassuring in the moment, the sort of thing any loving parent might say, and becomes almost unbearable in hindsight once you know exactly what happened only hours later. After dropping Jasmine off at school, Rena went home and picked up one of the double-barreled shotguns that Paul had left behind at the house when he moved out, a firearm that had belonged to the life they used to share together as a married couple. She got into her car and drove roughly 60 miles, out of the quiet, tree-lined stretch of Great Shefford and straight into the middle of West London, toward Chiswick High Road, toward the exact salon where Lorna Stewart was working that day. She walked into Equilibrium that September afternoon in 2002 with the shotgun in hand and found Lorna Stewart on shift, going about an entirely ordinary working day with no idea of what was coming. According to accounts given at trial, Lorna looked up, saw Rena standing there with a gun, and asked her directly whether she had come to shoot her. Rena answered that she had. She raised the shotgun and fired twice. Lorna Stewart was killed on the spot, inside the salon where she worked, in front of colleagues and clients who had no time to process what was happening before it was already over. She was 36 years old. What happened in the minutes immediately after the shooting is, in some ways, almost as unsettling as the shooting itself. Rena Salmon didn't run. She didn't try to escape the scene, dispose of the weapon, or come up with any kind of story. Instead, she picked up her phone right there and sent a text message to a friend that stated, in plain terms, that she had just shot Lorna, and that this wasn't a joke, as though she anticipated that whoever read those words might assume, for a moment, that she couldn't possibly be serious. Then she sat down in a chair inside the very salon where she had just killed a woman, and she waited there calmly for the police to arrive. When officers eventually got to the scene, Rena didn't resist arrest and didn't attempt to deny what she had done. She confessed almost immediately, describing plainly and without hesitation exactly what had happened. It later came out, only after the verdict had already been delivered, that Lorna Stewart had been 2 months pregnant with Paul's child at the time she was killed. It was a devastating detail for everyone connected to the case, but also a legally complicated one, because there was no evidence at all suggesting that Rena had known about the pregnancy at the moment she pulled the trigger. Because of that, the court ruled the fact of Lorna's pregnancy inadmissible as evidence during the trial itself, meaning the jury only learned about it once their verdict had already been reached and read out in court, a detail that arrived too late to shape anyone's judgment of what had happened. But that made the tragedy feel even heavier once it finally came to light. Rena Salmon's trial took place at the Old Bailey, London's Central Criminal Court, a building that has heard more than its fair share of headline-making murder cases across the decades. Rena pleaded not guilty to murder, not because she denied pulling the trigger or disputed any of the physical facts of what had happened inside that salon, but on the grounds of diminished responsibility, arguing that the depression she had sunk into following the collapse of her marriage had impaired her mental state to such a degree that she shouldn't be held fully, legally responsible for what she had done. Her legal team, led by a lawyer named Tam Ikram, presented that defense to the jury as her best realistic chance of avoiding a full murder conviction and the mandatory life sentence that came with it. Prosecutors, unsurprisingly, saw the entire sequence of events very differently. To them, this wasn't a portrait of a woman who had simply snapped in a fog of depression and grief, acting on impulse in a moment she couldn't control. This was someone with genuine military-grade firearms training, someone who had told a friend the day before the murder that she already had a gun in her possession, who had told her 10-year-old daughter, hours before the killing, to remember she was loved no matter what happened, who had then driven roughly 60 miles across the country with a loaded shotgun in her car, and who, once she reached her destination, had calmly confirmed to her victim that yes, she had indeed come there to shoot her. That entire sequence, prosecutors argued to the jury, wasn't consistent with someone whose judgment had simply collapsed in a single moment of overwhelming emotion. It read, instead, like the actions of someone who had planned. However painfully and however slowly it had built up inside her, exactly what she intended to do that day. Detective Inspector Steve Morris led the investigation into Lorna Stewart's murder, piecing together the timeline of that September day alongside the deeper, more complicated history between the two families involved. Over the course of the trial, the jury heard testimony from a range of witnesses connected to the case, including women who had worked alongside Lorna at the salon, among them Martine Burns and Lindsay Reese, who described to the court what they remembered from the moments leading up to and following the shooting. Keith Rodriguez, the husband whose discovery of that single email had first set the entire tragedy into motion months earlier, also appeared at the Old Bailey during proceedings, watching a case unfold that had already cost him his own marriage long before it ultimately cost Lorna her life as well. Rena's mother, Matilda Roberts, was present throughout much of the trial too. Sitting in the courtroom and watching her daughter face judgment for a killing that had grown, slowly and painfully, out of a decades-long marriage that had come apart in the space of less than a year. In the end, the diminished responsibility argument didn't hold up in front of the jury. They rejected it, and Rena Salmon was found guilty of murder. In May of 2003, roughly 8 months after the shooting, she was formally sentenced to life imprisonment, the mandatory sentence under English law for a murder conviction. It's worth pointing out just how differently this case sits in the public memory compared to so many others like it. Cases where a man kills his wife, or kills the man his wife left him for, tend to dominate headlines for years, get turned into documentaries, get talked about on true crime channels again and again. Rena Salmon's case never got that same level of lasting attention, even though it had almost every element true crime audiences are drawn to. A military-trained killer, a love triangle, a calm confession, an unborn child nobody knew about until after the verdict. Part of that may simply come down to the fact that this was a woman targeting another woman, her husband's lover, rather than the more familiar pattern of a man turning violent against a woman who left him. It doesn't make what happened to Lorna Stewart any less devastating, or any less deliberate, but it does help explain why a case with this much drama inside it slipped past so many people who follow true crime closely. For years afterward, Rena Salmon remained largely out of the public eye, serving out her sentence away from the cameras and headlines that had surrounded her original trial back in 2003. She was eventually released on parole after serving 14 years behind bars, re-entering a world that had moved on considerably in the time she had been away. Life after prison wasn't easy for her. She suffered a heart attack during a home visit, and while being treated for that heart condition, doctors also diagnosed her with breast cancer, layering one serious health crisis on top of another during a period that was already difficult enough on its own. In interviews given after her release, Rena said she felt genuine remorse for what she had done, insisting that her original intention that day had never actually been to kill Lorna outright, but rather to make her understand, in the rawest and most immediate way imaginable, the real consequences of the affair. And she even suggested she had, at some point, considered turning the gun on herself in front of Lorna instead. She described the thinking that led her to walk into that salon as disjointed, warped by grief and betrayal that had built up over the better part of a year, but she stopped well short of claiming any kind of innocence in what had ultimately happened. She described herself, in her own words, as someone who would carry the weight of that single afternoon for the rest of her life, unable to fully set it down no matter how much time passed. Even her relationship with her own daughter didn't emerge from any of this untouched. Years after Rena's release from prison, reports surfaced describing a dispute between her and Jasmine, the very same little girl she had once told, from the driver's seat of a car parked outside a school gate, to always remember that she was loved no matter what happened next. The disagreement reportedly centered on a flat that Jasmine had apparently not transferred into her mother's name following Rena's release. A small, almost mundane, practical conflict that nonetheless spoke volumes about just how much had been permanently altered inside that family because of a single afternoon in a Chiswick hair salon 2 decades earlier. What makes this case linger more than 20 years on isn't just the affair itself, or the betrayal, or even the shocking speed with which one woman's private grief turned into public gunfire on a busy London high street. It's the contrast sitting right at the center of the whole story. A woman trained by her own country to stay precise and controlled under real pressure, who then spent 18 years quietly building an ordinary, comfortable life with a man she genuinely loved, ultimately used that very same training in the most devastating way imaginable, walking calmly into a salon on an otherwise unremarkable afternoon, asking almost nothing, saying almost nothing, and then simply sitting down afterward to wait. Lorna Stewart went to work that day expecting nothing more than another ordinary shift at Equilibrium, treating clients on a busy stretch of Chiswick High Road, and she never got the chance to raise the child she was carrying, or grow older, or find out what came next in the new life she had only just started building with Paul. Rena Salmon, meanwhile, spent the rest of her life carrying the full weight of a decision that had taken shape over the course of a single unbearable year. A decision that started with an email discovered on a computer screen in a quiet Berkshire village, and ended with her sitting alone in a chair inside a London salon, waiting calmly for the sound of sirens she already knew, somewhere inside herself, were coming.